The snow came down like judgment that morning, soft as ash, piling up on the shingles, and the crooked sign that swung outside Miller's Mercantile. It tucked itself into every seam of Timber Hollow, held the town breathless beneath a blanket so white it made all the sins look small. June Miller pushed open the mercantile door, and the bell trilled like a small, lonely confession. Flour, tobacco, a coil of rope, her arms full, her breath fogging. She saw the children first. The two of them were at the far end of the street, white-knuckled and frantic. A scrap of a woman on her knees beside a man who was not moving. Her boots hit the boardwalk before her mind put together what her hands already knew. That figure was Tom Archer, the miller from 3 miles up the ridge, his face ashen, his hat fallen into the snow. The children, little Elsie and Bart, were crying with an animal, childlike horror no one in Timber Hollow had seen before. They were alone. The men who stood clustered around the post office and the saloon talked in muffled, polite voices that pretended this was someone else's tragedy. They pretended because pretending was something the well-kept men of Timber Hollow did when the wind turned cold and the accounts needed balancing. June did not pretend. She was small-boned and broad-shouldered from decades of working the land, her hair braided back in a way that suggested practicality over prettiness. Widowhood had taught her how to split a stove of wood without flinching, how to hold the breath of a frightened child until it slowed. She dropped her flour and crossed the street, 2 fingers to Tom's neck, a careful tilt of the head. He was breathing but slurred, feverish. His hands were ice. The doctor was away in the next county for better pay, and a woman's presence could be seen as some sort of presumption in Timber Hollow. But June had a mind that cut through custom like a plow through spring sod. "Put him in my wagon," she said to old Matt, who ran the blacksmith's forge. "Get the blanket box and fetch Harlan's horse." Her voice left no room for argument. Someone muttered that a woman, alone, should not be sticking her nose into other people's business, and June answered with the push of her shoulder against the wagon's tongue. The horses took to the road. The town watched from windows and doorways and looked away when they thought no one was watching. That's how debts and favors both got tallied in Timber Hollow, by noticing and then deciding whether you'd pay. Tom woke to steam and the smell of boiled roots in a cabin June had kept warm all morning. Her kettle shook over the stove. Children's laughter, cautious and bright, sifted through the rafters. The 2 Archer children were curled by the hearth, while June moved with the steady efficiency of a woman who had learned to make do and mend things that were supposed to be beyond her. She set a tin cup to his lips. "You've got a fever," she said. "You're not to move until I say so." Tom spat a thin laugh. "Town's gossip will have a fit, June. My mill—" His voice broke. "I was on night watch. We keep the sacks stacked, the blades oiled. Can't do that if I'm in a bed." His pride was a brittle thing, knuckled up around older loss. June kneaded her hands into his and steadied him like a steadying beam. "You'll live. The mill will survive you, if you let it." She poured him drink, and her face softened in a kind of tired way that made him hate himself for needing it. She could have left then. The small kindness returned to the ledger of small, anonymous mercies. She did not. Snow came early that year, a bitter hammer that made fingers numb and horses skittish. A drayman's anger or a ledger shaken wrong could topple a man in Timber Hollow more effectively than a gun. Rumors spread like frost. The bank had been calling in notes. Warren Kittredge, the town's broker and unofficial arbiter of the Hollow's morals, had been buying up land. There'd been a fire by Archer's mill 2 winters back that left Tom hunched and someone mentioning that Tom had been hard on pay. January's cold did not excuse malice. Tom Hall was discharged from June's care with a grudging gratitude and a stack of vouchers from June's own chest. He promised to return the favor. People made promises in Timber Hollow the way men made wagers, eager when they stirred and quick to forget when the cups were set down. But seed takes root where it is given water. June walked home through the snow, a small black figure against a vast pale field, and the town returned to the business of looking at itself with the polite detachment of those who would rather see a neighbor fall than be dragged into complicity. The trouble in the hollow had a face and a ledger. Warren Kittredge wore good coats and a smile that could be equally warm to a benefactor or cold as frost to a debtor. He'd come to Timber Hollow 5 years back, with a trunk of papers and eyes that liked to measure people in acres and notes. He'd made a fortune on timber rights and lawsuits, on foreclosed farms and dying promises. He had a clerk, a keen-faced young man named Lyle, who kept the books straight and the ledger balanced in his shadow. On mild afternoons, Warren would stand on the bank stoop and look over the town like a man looking over a chessboard. Timber Hollow could be managed with a combination of good notes and quiet threats. Men with families and no backers could be bulldozed under paper. It was clean and efficient, and Warren liked things that were clean. Warren's next move came slow and precise. He sent notices to the good folk whose debts would never balance with any reasonable harvest, and allowed rumors to do the rest of his work. He made suggestions to the council, minor things at first, then not so minor, that favored his interests and pinched others into places where they could be persuaded. People sighed and accepted. That's what fear does. It makes you bargain at a slap price for the safety you already deserve. June found the notice about her own land stuck to her cabin door like an accusation. 3 overdue installments. Foreclosure proceedings to commence in 30 days if payment was not received. She went to the town hall that overcast afternoon, as if to place a brick into the town's mouth. The council, men with furrowed brows and a taste for order, read the notice and coughed the way old men do when gratitude must be dressed up in propriety. "It's the law, Mrs. Miller," Elder Grady told her when she asked if there was any way to delay it. "We're not in the business of fighting it for every woman who gets behind." June left the hall with paper in her pocket and a kind of slow, building rage in her chest. It felt like cold wind through a missing door. She'd lost a husband to the river, a man who had slipped beneath the ice 3 years earlier while fixing a mill wheel. They had labored together and split the small harvests, had laughed on summer nights, and sewn the rotting fence with hands that kept sewing. After he died, the Hollow had said gentle things and praised her for being stoic. Stoic does not pay notes on time. She could have sold the few things she had, given up the land and gone east to some relative that had been named once. She could have bent her head and learned the arithmetic of meekness. Instead, she went to the bank. Warren met her with a smile like a trapdoor. "Mrs. Miller," he said, as if she were a legal formality and his satisfaction came from being kindly precise. "I see this is a simple matter." "It's a matter of my home," she answered. "My husband's grave is on that land. My sweat is in the stone fences. There's a pond where we planted willows. There's my name on the deed. I didn't borrow to make wine or to keep a saloon. I borrowed to put seed in the ground." Warren's face did not change. He handed her a neatly typed proposition that had been carefully composed to be more humiliating than helpful. He would defer the mortgage if she took his offer. Marry him and the debt would be cleared. Marry him. The words were precise and blunt like a blade. He cloaked it in practicality, in stability. He called it care for a woman alone. It was, in truth, the most efficient acquisition of the decade. Land transfer through social maneuver rather than law, with the benefit of keeping a moralized veneer. June listened to him like a woman who had sat through sermons, promising heaven and had seen men turn their doctrine into a commodity. She left the bank with the paper in her pocket, and a new kind of clarity blossomed in her chest, bright and dangerous. The cold made the edges of the world sharper. The white landscape turned every shadow into an accusation. A woman's heart could be broken, and still be heavy with purpose. June kept working, the rhythm of her hands the only thing that quieted the humming anger. She mended fences and salted the basements, sewed the thin cloth that would be their winter undergarment. Each nail she pounded felt like an answer hammered into the day. The first act of rebellion was small. She took the wagon down to Tom Archer's mill and offered to trade labor for timber, shingle bolts, lengths of board. Tom, whose wife had died in the summer of the sickness, and who kept the mill because the river remembered its duty to turn, was surprised. "It's charity," he said. "It's work," June said, "and I pay in labor when I don't have coin." The agreement was made and the mill whirred again. Timber fell, boards were planed, and June's hands ached in a way that woke the teeth of winter from their sleep. Warren did not like to be inconvenienced. He spread the tale that June had been living beyond her means, her habit of feeding stray hands in a storm, of taking in a sputtering widow child, was framed as profligacy. "She's reckless with the town's kindness," he told gossipers in his office. The town liked gossip tied into a tidy moral framework. It let them be both righteous and comfortable. But June had a kind of stubbornness that did not care for reputations. She kept going, kept building. One midnight in late January, the Archer Mill's wheel creaked with a rhythm there was no reason for. Someone had jammed a metal wedge, a sabotage that would have split wood if the wheel had turned the wrong way. Tom was in his bed with fever. June found the wedge and the scuff marks near the bank, tire tracks, and a footprint that had been polished by a heavy heel. She followed the track like a hound, down by the river where a shadow of warmth showed through the snow. It led to the edge of town, near the bank where Warren kept his ledger and his conscience in balanced pockets. She could have taken the proof to the council. She could have made a complaint, placed the matter in the dull, respectable hands of law and procedure. But law in Timber Hollow was a thing that often needed more backing than a woman could muster. She took the evidence to her hands instead. The night she found the wedge, she also found something else. A ledger tucked in the hollow of a rotting fence post. A leather book, Warren's hand in it, as clear as frost on a window. It listed payments to men who were supposed to do the bank's bidding. It listed timings and scuffles to be instigated, notices misdelivered. It listed names. The list had June's mortgage among others, her breath left in a thin ribbon. She did not burn the book. She wrapped it in oiled cloth and took it back to her cabin. She read it by lamplight, and the entries read like an accounting of cruelty. Foreclosures under the guise of necessity. Fires lit to clear land for purchase. Men encouraged to threaten tenants so that they'd leave, and Warren would buy the lot cheap. The ledger was a map of Warren's hands. June had been patient her whole life, patient in the way of women who stretched a crust of bread and a thin coat and made both be enough through a hard winter. But she had not been quiet. Her anger was not the shallow kind. It was a slow, burning thing that laid down plans like tracks. She knew what the law would do in the bright rooms. She also knew the law would likely serve Warren's wishes, because he spoke to the law in coin. Justice in Timber Hollow came with a fee. She began to move in the way that winter moves, quietly, inevitably. She gathered a small handful of townfolk, Tom, who owed her a life, old Matt the blacksmith, who'd been cheated by a poorly timed Leon, Lyle the clerk, who watched the books too long and had grown hollow with conscience, a few women whose farms had been quietly bled dry by tightened notes, and a council that folded its hands. June showed them the ledger, like one shows a map to conspirators. It lay between them on the table, the ink dark as a wound. "We don't want to raise guns," June said. Her voice was not loud. She did not have to be. "We want to show the town the truth." They debated. Some wanted to take it to the preacher or to Elder Grady. Some wanted to post the ledger at the door of the bank. Lyle argued that public shame could be just as binding as courts, if done right. "People listen when their neighbors speak," he said. "If we make them see it, we make them choose a side." The plan took shape like frost on a window pane, subtle and strong. They would gather evidence, copy names, make the ledger transparent. They would get signatures. They would make of the ledger a mirror so the town would look and not be able to look away. The first sign was the postcard nailed to the telegraph pole. Public meeting. Town Hall. Affairs of Timber Hollow. It was neutral, the kind of notice the town printed for hay auctions and lost horses. But June and the others had plastered the notice with testimony and affidavits copied from the ledger. They had faces, dates, receipts, and a small army of names who had been quietly bullied. The town gathered out of a mixture of curiosity and civic duty. Timber Hollow had not seen a meeting like that since the year the river swamped the Willow Acres. People came with mufflers pulled high and suspicion like an old friend. Warren stood at the head of the room with his ledger in his briefcase, his face composed, his smile tempered into something that smelled faintly of regret. He called it slander. He called it rumor. He called their petitions emotionalism. He said that he had built the town up on credit. had provided the bank so that men could borrow and start. He laid out plans for expansion and for the betterment of Timber Hollow. He offered to defer a few overdue notes as a gesture of goodwill if people would accept that his methods had been necessary and that, ultimately, he was the Hollow's benefactor. But June had placed an unfolded truth on the table. Copies of the ledger, notes about the wheel wedge, receipts for bribes paid to men to carry out small intimidations, and a careful paper trail that connected the dots. Lyle stood and handed a folder of signatures gathered from men and women who'd been pushed, intimidated, called rogues if they objected. People began to read. Fingers trembled over names they recognized. Faces in the room shifted color the way the sky shifts before a storm. "You call this slander?" June asked, standing in the middle of the packed room. She had no inclination for long speeches. She had a way of speaking like a woman who had wrestled storms into submission. Short sentences, certain words. "Warren Kittredge has foreclosed on 3 families this season and bought their land through court papers signed under duress. He pressured men into breaking mills. He paid others to start fires on properties he wanted. He asked a widow to sell herself in exchange for her home. That's not charity. That's taking advantage." There were gasps and a few mutters. Warren's face was a mask being taken off slowly. He attempted a rejoinder, then paused. He had not expected a ledger made public in such a clean, relentless way. People stood, read. Faces that had been quiet for too long found words. Men who had been bullied into silence spoke about threats whispered in saloons. Women who had been ashamed of near poverty found their shame replaced by a righteous anger. The preacher, who had once prided himself on turning social conversation into the balm of forgiveness, could not find a sermon that dressed greed in mercy. Warren made for the door. He would have to file suits, make threats, hire lawyers. He promised to clear June's mortgage if she retracted her accusations. She refused. "My name isn't for sale," she said. So he did what men do when they lose control of the ledger. He struck at the things one cannot replace with law. That night a fire was set at the Archer Mill, carefully with kerosene and a supper of old sacks, and the mill's wheel was twisted out of alignment irrevocably. It was bad enough that it took weeks to repair. Old Matt's forge had its bellows cut. A barn where a woman kept winter stores was broken into and ruined. The attacks were precise and ugly, a pattern of intimidation that went beyond law and touched the animal fear of women alone at night. June waited for the town's outrage to be enough. It was not. Timber Hollow could be a tender place until convenience asked it to be cautious. But the ledger had changed things. It had given people a mirror. The ledger produced a list of names, those who had taken money and those who had been pushed, and public opinion began to harden not just into gossip, but into resolve. Men who had been content to be quiet found that the ledger was an indictment of things they had rationalized or participated in, and some of them were ashamed. Shame used rightly can become a catalyst. Warren got greedy and clumsy. He showed up at June's property with a sheriff's deputy to serve eviction papers at dawn, expecting compliance. They found the gate chained and the path watched. June stood at the door with a rifle across the lintel, and the 2 Archer children behind her. "You'll not take my land," she said. Her voice had the steady weight of one who had put love and hands into the shape of a place. The sheriff, a man who remembered his own father's debts, looked at the women and thought about the ledger and about thunder on a roof. He folded the papers, said he'd be back with a court order, and left with a hesitation in his stride. For a time it felt like the town was a tense thing ready to snap. Warren made threats about lawsuits and gestures of legal retribution. He dangled the promise of some men's betterment if they'd only choose him as benefactor again. But the ledger had raised the temperature. People saw their complicity and did not like the reflection. There were whispers that Sue Henderson, the widow who ran the livery stable, had had her barn ropes cut last year. The turning point was not a speech or a single act of heroism. There were stories of a burned claim on the North Road that had recently been filed in Warren's favor. A man who had once been a colleague of Warren's in a city that liked order began to run like water. Lyle had smuggled him, thin at the edges, found things but gathering law could not easily dismiss. He issued a temporary injunction against sale and sent deputies to preserve the land while an inquiry took place. Warren triggered his lawyers and they filed motions and threatened countersuits until the run of depositions looked like a new parish of paperwork. Timber Hollow was suddenly the town that doing the right thing had organized. It still wasn't enough for a man who wanted the ledger destroyed. On a late March afternoon, when the snow had turned to the gray mud that steals patience from the soul, Warren came to June's gate with a retinue and a smirk, like a man who expects a stage. He had meant to humiliate her, to make her withdraw. Instead, he found the gate open and the people gathered not as docile victims but as a community. Tom stood with a gangly sling across his shoulder. Old Matt's face was black with coal dust. The preacher had a thick folder under his arm. Even a few of those town councilmen who had earlier smiled politely now stood with sober faces. "You cannot besmirch honest enterprise," Warren barked into the cold. He thought of his success as inevitable, and that arrogance had blinded him to the slow arithmetic of dignity. "Withdraw your names. Let this be settled discreetly." June did not move. She had stood watching winter come and had watched it go away before. Her life had been a ledger of endurance. The town had watched her carry burdens and called it a woman's lot. She had come, finally, to the place where endurance needed a sharper edge. "Take your hands off other people's lives," she said. "You measure men by what they owe you, but what you owe is this town." She spoke of the burned barns, the men whose mills had slowed, the women who had lost the small savings they used to buy school books. She read from the ledger like one reading a sermon, and the town listened. Warren's reply was practical. Money, paperwork, threats. But threats have little currency when everyone stands to lose dignity. The judge's inquiry continued. The county found enough evidence to file charges of conspiracy to commit fraud against the bank and for the coercion of tenants. Subpoenas went out, and old friends of Warren's in the legal world found themselves squeezed by the tidy, ugly pages of his own hand. His defense buckled under the weight of documented, repeated acts. In the end, Warren Kittredge did what men without friends do when the law closes in. They left. He fled with his clerk and his coats and the papers he could carry. There were a few whispered stories that he'd gone east to avoid the shame, as if the wealthy can ever simply lay their sins down like a cloak. The law took what it could. The bank's windows were cleaned, the books audited by men who did not like to be associated with scandal. Timber Hollow had scars, but it also had a ledger of a different sort now, the names on petitions, and the story of a town choosing a side. June did not feel victorious in a way fireworks might have proclaimed. Victory is a quiet thing in the middle of a long, ordinary life. She stayed on her land. The mortgage was set aside by a council vote, driven by Elder Grady and the signatures of those who had once turned away. The judge ordered restitution where it could be identified. Tom's mill was rebuilt with a community fund gathered from men and women who had been ashamed and wanted to put something right. They burned the ledger publicly in a small ceremony, not as a gesture of destruction, but as a promise to measure one another with better means. There was no grand parade. Timber Hollow was not a place of parades. It was a place of work and late suppers and hands that had calluses polished by honesty. June walked her fence lines with a slow satisfaction, and the knowledge that justice had been earned through small, precise acts of courage, rather than a single heroic gesture. It was the kind of justice that did not make enemies out of the whole town, but made them choose. Some left and some stayed. The hollow would be quieter for a time, but it would also be steadier. There were moments when June considered what the ledger had cost her. She had not sought revenge for the pleasure of it. She had wanted the town to be a place where a widow could keep her land, and a child could learn the chores without fear. She had wanted people to be judged by what they did in winter, not what they wore in summer. There was a taste in her mouth now sometimes of things kept, like the coppery tang of blood, but the good kind that keeps one from wasting oneself on fear. On a spring evening when the river thawed and the willows swilled green, Tom and the children brought her a basket of fresh-baked bread and a bottle of claret. They sat on her porch and watched the sun burn off the last of the snow. "You did good," Tom said, his voice creaky with new respect. "You didn't just fight for yourself." June's laugh was small. "I fought because I won't be told to sell myself where there's no need. I fought because my husband's hands are in these fences, and I won't let a ledger drag what's left of him into someone else's coat pocket." They ate, and the children told of school and of being raced by the river. There was an everydayness to their voices that warmed June more than any coin. She had not married revenge to honey. She had not supped on it. Justice had been an instrument, not a celebration. She thought sometimes of Warren, of how easy it is to think yourself a benefactor when you've learned to manage fear with paper. She thought of what it means to measure a man by whether he stands with you when the wolves come, and she wondered if Warren had ever had to choose. In the months that followed, the hollow settled into a kind of steady hum. People mended the fences they'd let sag. The council set up a small committee to oversee fair lending. The ledger that had been a map of malice had been turned into evidence of the necessity of oversight and a moral lesson wrapped in charity. Lyle the clerk left Warren and took a job with the county, and he visited June now and then with a new sort of tiredness in his face. The clean kind. The kind that comes from having done something right, despite fear. June lit a small lantern each night and set it in her window. The kind of beacon fishermen set for boats so they might find shore. It became a small tradition in the hollow. The widow's light, they called it at first in half-teasing affection, then in real gratitude. People felt that light like a promise that someone kept watch while the rest of the town slept. It was not only for her, it was for the children who sometimes came to sit on her stoop and ask about the winter that nearly stole them. It was for the men who needed a place to hitch their morals to the post of honesty. One autumn, at harvest, when the harvest was generous and the frost came later, giving the corn a lucent depth, June stood at the edge of a field and watched the sun set the new fence posts on fire with color. Tom's new wheel turned steadily in the mill. The town had repaired itself like a stitch healed with good thread. She walked the rows and found a note tucked beneath a stone at her boundary, a scrap of paper folded thrice with a careful hand. Inside, in ink the color of old tea, a simple line, "For standing." No name, no flourish, just gratitude. She kept the note in her shirt pocket for a long time. It warmed her like a coin. She thought about how justice had been meted not with applause, but with steadiness. The kind of steadiness that keeps a roof from leaking and a child from learning to fear the night. Revenge and justice had danced together in Timber Hollow, a careful tango that did not let either partner lead too long. They had found a way to right wrongs without letting rage swallow the town whole. That was the quiet miracle. The community had chosen to defend the vulnerable instead of letting fear make decisions for them. On a cold evening, some years after the ledger had been burned, a handful of children built a small effigy of Warren Kittredge and pushed it into the river to watch it bob and spin and finally go under. No one rejoiced in his leaving. There were no songs. There were only the normal human gestures of relief and the patience to go on. June watched them and felt a tired sort of pride. She had been a small woman in a wide world of snow and debt, and she had kept her hands honest. People sometimes asked if she forgave Warren. Forgiveness was a long kind of tool. It was not the same as forgetting. June's answer was that she forgave the town its tardiness, but not the abuse. She forgave inasmuch as she had to in order to keep herself from being poisoned by hatred. Forgiveness did not mean she had to sit quietly while men used paper to declare their supremacy. Forgiveness, in her hands, meant making room for the work of repair, and making sure the ledger of memory recorded not just the deeds of one, but the lessons learned by many. Winter returned sometimes like the taste of iron. There were storms and small cruelties, and men who would always be tempted to measure their worth in acres and numbers. But Timber Hollow had become a town that looked at itself a little sterner in the mirror. It had learned the cost of silence. The ledger had reminded them that survival was not only about keeping the farm, but about feeding the town's moral hunger. June kept her light in the window, and on cold nights, some of the townsfolk would pass by and tip their hat in a way that said, "We remember. We will stand." When at last she grew older and her hair threaded with silver, the children she'd tended helped with the chores, and the town honored their promise in small ways. They helped mend her roof before winter. They kept an eye on her well. They came to her porch in the long evenings with news and gossip and laughter. She watched them with a kind of calm that comes from a life spent living in accordance with the rules you choose, rather than those imposed on you. She kept the scrap of paper that had simply read, "For standing," in a biscuit tin with old buttons, and a coin Tom had given her for her birthday one year. It was ordinary and precious. In the end, the ledger had been less about vengeance than about the righting of scales. June had not set fire to Warren or beaten him in the dust. She had taken his own ledger and turned it into a mirror for the town. When a community chooses to look and to act, revenge sharpens into justice, and justice settles into a future that can be held like the warm hands of a neighbor in a storm. Timber Hollow did not become perfect. It had the same rough edges it always had, but now it had a new habit, the habit of choosing one another before the ledger chose them. She died in a bed that had been her husband's and later her own, with a small circle of hands around her that had not betrayed nor been betrayed. The town held a small funeral where the preacher read words that sounded better because they were earned by a life lived in stubborn honesty. Tom and the children stood and spoke of her like the people who had been given a map back to themselves. The judge who'd once signed the injunction walked the hymnals to the front and told a story about a woman who had taught a town that justice is a muscle to be exercised, not a trophy to be hoarded. They buried her under a small stone that read simply, "June Miller, who stood." And in the years after, when the winter threatened and a rumor would start to curl through the streets like smoke, people would look up at the widow's light in June's old window, kept lit by whoever lived in her cabin now, and they would remember the ledger and the way the town had chosen. They would remember that revenge can be a teacher, and that justice, slow, patient, exacting, can heal a place if its people are brave enough to make it so. The end.